Now back to the show. This is The Law Show on CL 650.
The fascinating and very complicated issue of citizenship is up for discussion this morning on The Law Show. Rudy Kisher and Alex Stojcevic are lawyers, immigration lawyers, with Maynard Kisher Stojcevic in Vancouver, talking about all of these changes. And I mentioned, lots of changes last year. There were more changes January 1st. More changes just happened on April 1st. Alex has pointed out there are even more coming down on June 1st. It's confusing. It's tough to keep up with for lawyers, and this is what you do for a living. So imagine how members of the general public, Rudy, are trying desperately to just keep up with all of this in order to be able to try and bring in a family member or whatever. And in a lot of cases, the confusion is debilitating, isn't it?
Well, it can add to a lot of hardship. And we have cases in our office where people finally come in to see us and they say, I've been waiting years to sponsor my husband, and we've been separated over this time because, I don't have a job. I don't think I'm working, but I don't think I'm making enough money. And that's a misunderstanding that the Act doesn't require spouses to be making a certain amount of money to be able to sponsor their spouse, right? Because the government gives you the same forms as if you're sponsoring your parents and grandparents, where you do have to be making a certain amount of money.
Okay, right.
And so they fill out the forms and they take a look at it and say, I'm not making enough cash, and I'll wait. I'm going to wait a year till I make enough. I didn't make enough money this year. So they wait for years separated from their spouse, thinking they can't sponsor. Or they may have a past criminal record that might have been for something very minor, and they think for some reason that bars them for sponsorship. Right. And so they don't make the application. And so, it's very heartbreaking to see those cases come in where people have gone through that hardship and expense that everything's been delayed.
Or just lived in the dark much longer than they needed to, Rudy. And I guess the intimidation of the lawyers and, you guys cost a fortune, and if I can't afford to bring my husband in, I certainly can't afford to talk to a lawyer.
And that's, and maybe hiring a lawyer for the entire process is not what they need.
Of course.
And often this process, sometimes they can do it on their own. But coming in for a consultation with a lawyer, with ourselves perhaps, gives them, at least puts them on the right track, saying, listen, that's not an issue. Go ahead and apply. Right. Or you're applying under the wrong category. Or that's never going to happen. No, you can forget about it. This is, you're going the wrong way around this, and it can really make a big change for them. So it's worthwhile, although it may, you don't have to come in for the whole thing in terms of, retaining someone to give the whole process to you, but just to make sure you're on the right track. Right?
Exactly. Just a few minutes with a pro, Alex, to just figure out where you're at and what you have to do to achieve your objective.
And really, in some ways, in some instances, just alerting people to potential problems.
Sure.
One of the current sort of issues that affect a lot of practices that didn't exist 10, 12 years ago is the area of reproductive technology. You go abroad because you can't conceive a child here. There are other options in the United States or internationally that are not available here.
True.
So you decide, after much soul searching with your spouse, you go abroad, you take advantage of this, you spend a small fortune.
Definitely.
To be later told that the child that's been created has an issue with the fact that whether it's Canadian or not. Okay? And so that your listeners understand the context of this, traditionally we take the view that a child that is adopted abroad has to be sponsored for permanent residence. That changed in 2008, and then 2009 after Supreme Court of Canada case initiated some change. So now adopted children are treated the same way that biological children will be treated.
Okay.
Although you have to prove the adoption process is creating the same type of parent-child bond that would have been created otherwise. And so in international adoption cases, that's what we often have to do. We have to look at, was the adoption, does it meet the requirements in Canada? What are the circumstances behind the adoption? And parents often don't think of the immigration legalities of this before they go abroad, and that's one place where we're definitely invaluable.
But at least with that sort of child, they've come from a state agency or something else. Whereas whether it's a surrogate that you've paid an enormous sum of money to produce a child for you.
Well, that's where we have a problem.
That's a whole other category, isn't it?
Because if there is no direct biological connection to the parents, at the moment the state of the law in Canada is that those are not children of a Canadian citizen. And those children either have to be adopted or they have to be sponsored for permanent residence before they can come to Canada.
So
a lot of parents don't know that.
You would
before
think,
they
though,
go
that
ahead.
if someone's going to spend, Rudy, what we assume the amount of money to have a surrogate and do the in vitro fertilization, it's an expensive process. You would think that someone that committed to the process would seek legal advice before going abroad to initiate the process.
You'd hope, but the sad thing is sometimes these things are missed, right? There's an assumption that they fly across the U.S. border all the time. It's not a big deal. I show my passport. I'll get a birth certificate down in California. I should be able to bring my child up.
Sure.
And all of a sudden you get a call. They're at the border. They're having issues, or they're flying down there. And now they start to think about it, and they look at the webpage. They're like, well, maybe the birth certificate is not going to show me as the father. How am I going to get this child? And what are the rights? Or they show up in Canada. I mean, I have a couple. They're in Canada with the child.
Right.
And they come to you and they say, well, so how do I get my kid's passport? And I'm like, well, so hold on. Number one, they're illegally here. I hate to tell you this. You brought them in, they let you in at the border, but that child actually has got no status in Canada now because of stay beyond their visitor status, and we have to make an application. And
Canadian mom, Canadian dad. Arrived as a babe in arms.
A babe in arms.
Born from a surrogate
mother. Well, maybe
but has no status in Canada.
Let's take it Canadian permanent residence. So
okay,
let's say so there's no right by birth. They've been living here. They could be permanent residents for 20 years. And if the child is born abroad and they're bringing it back, they haven't, or they've adopted the child abroad and they haven't gone through the immigration process. They assume, well, I did through the whole process wherever they did it, whether it was in the States or
right.
in another country. They assume that those rights are going to be transferred automatically.
And there you go, Alex. There's the assumption again that it is pretty reasonable to go to, but wrong.
And the other thing is that in many countries we don't have the same level of legal scrutiny of these types of relationships as are expected in Canada. So
right.
you have a brother dies, so the other brother just simply takes his children, and those children are raised as that brother's children.
Absolutely.
Then the person immigrates, and all of a sudden, well, sorry, you're not the father, sir. You need to go through a legal adoption process. Meanwhile, these children have been with this person their entire lives.
Sure.
So you have some unfortunate situations like that do also arise where there is no reproductive technologies, just the law of the country where they're coming from.
Right. Well, this we said we were going to talk about family class applications, and we have. But by gosh, we've spent the better part of an hour on it, Rudy, and we've just barely scratched the surface. It is the whole immigration file is enormously complicated, but even the subcategory of family class is enormously complicated.
Yeah, it's definitely if you're doing anything across the border, my advice is go see somebody and talk to somebody, because just because you drive across that border to go shopping, it's not the same when you're moving a family member to Canada.
Right. You can check out our guests on their website, which is vancouverlaw.ca. Their offices are at 1168 Hamilton Street, Vancouver, and they are Maynard, Kisher, Stoicevich, immigration and citizenship lawyers. And Rudy and Alex, great to see you again. Thanks for coming out. I look forward to our next gathering already.
Thanks a lot, Stu, for having us.
Thank you, Sterling.
And we'll see you next time here on The Law Show.